It is November the 25th, in the year of our Lord 1177. The air over the coastal plain near the hill of Montgisard is thick and heavy. It smells of dust, horse sweat, and a chilling, almost tangible fear. Imagine this scene, as if painted by a mad master of battle canvases. On one side, upon the hill, a tiny handful of warriors is frozen in place, an island of steel and despair in a boundless sea of hostile land. There are no more than 500 knights, encased in iron from head to toe, their lances a sparse fence against the leaden sky. Behind them stand a few thousand infantrymen, militiamen, and Turco-Poles, their faces masks of sweat and grime, their eyes fixed on a silent question. Is this the end? This is all that remains of the kingdom of Jerusalem. And against them, down below, the Saracen army spreads out like an ocean that has breached its shores. The chronicles will name a figure of 26,000, perhaps 30,000 warriors. The Sultan's Mamluks, Syrian emirs, Egyptian cavalry, Nubian archers. There are so many that the earth groans under their horses' hooves, and the glint of their curved scimitars and gilded helmets is blinding. This is the army of Saladin, the unifier of Islam, a conqueror whose name has already become a legend from Baghdad to Cairo. And in the center of this handful of doomed Christians stands a figure shrouded in mystery. A 16-year-old youth, King Baldwin IV. His face is hidden behind a smooth silver mask, concealing not just his features, but the destructive work of a disease that is eating away his flesh. His left hand hangs uselessly, wrapped in silk. His right grips the reins. He is a living dead man, the Leper King, a symbol of decay and decline. And it is this dying boy who is about to lead his men in a charge against an invincible army. In this moment, in this frozen frame before a suicidal attack, is concentrated the entire paradox, the whole drama, and the central question of our story. How, in the name of all the saints, did this sick child manage to crush the greatest warrior of his time? To understand how this insane victory was possible, one must first glance at the geopolitical chessboard upon which this bloody game was played. The Crusader states, founded at the end of the 11th century, were by the 77th year of the 12th century a fragile, patchwork quilt thrown over the coast of the Levant. The Kingdom of Jerusalem, the County of Tripoli, the Principality of Antioch, all were essentially Christian outposts, thin strips of land squeezed between the sea and a hostile, gradually unifying Islamic world. It was a world of contrasts. Dozens of languages were spoken in the narrow streets of Acre and Jerusalem. French barons built impregnable castles. Venetian and Genoese merchants conducted brisk trade. And the knightly orders, the Templars and Hospitallers, created their own state within a state, answering only to the Pope. But beneath this outward brilliance lurked a constant threat. The Franks, as they were called in the East, were foreigners. Their power rested on the strength of arms and a chain of mighty fortresses like Crac des Chevaliers or Montfort. They were a minority, separated by thousands of miles from their European homeland, and each new generation born in the Holy Land felt its isolation more acutely. And from the East, a new, formidable power was rising. The era of fragmented Seljuk emirates, which had allowed the first Crusaders to succeed, was coming to an end. A Kurdish warlord, Yusuf ibn Ayyub, whom the world would remember as Salah al-Din or Saladin, had emerged on the scene. He was not just another sultan, he was a unifier, a charismatic leader who managed to subdue Egypt and then Syria, proclaiming a sacred goal: jihad, the expulsion of the infidels from Jerusalem. Warriors from all over the Islamic world, eager to reclaim Al-Quds, gathered under his banners. Thus, the Kingdom of Jerusalem became a besieged fortress, a Christian island in a boiling ocean of Islamic revival. Every year brought new raids, and every spring an invasion had to be expected. And at the very heart of this geopolitical volcano, on a throne of ivory and gold, sat a boy who did not know that the invisible seal of fate had already touched his flesh. Baldwin IV carried in his veins the blood of great ancestors, the burden and glory of the Angevin dynasty that ruled Jerusalem. His lineage was a tapestry woven from threads of courage, piety, and political ambition. His grandfather, Fulk of Anjou, was a powerful European lord who left his domains in France to become the king consort of a distant eastern kingdom. His father, Amalric I, was a warrior king and diplomat, a man of immense physical strength and a sharp mind, who spent his entire life trying to strengthen the Frankish position through ambitious, though ultimately unsuccessful, campaigns in Egypt. From these ancestors, Baldwin inherited not just a crown, but an innate sense of duty, the understanding that being king of Jerusalem was less a privilege than a sacred obligation, a cross to be borne to the end. The dynasty to which he belonged ruled a land where every stone breathed history, where the very earth was considered holy. They were the guardians of the Holy Sepulchre, the protectors of Christian pilgrims from all over the world. This legacy placed a colossal responsibility on the young prince from the moment he was born. He was being prepared to be a knight, a commander, a strategist, and a ruler. From an early age, he was taught Latin and history, the art of fortification, and the tactics of desert warfare. He was meant to become the ideal monarch, capable of withstanding the growing threat. But fate, or as medieval chroniclers would say, Providence itself, was preparing a completely different trial for him, one far more terrible than any Saracen army. It was an internal, invisible enemy invasion that began long before he could comprehend its nature. The legacy of his ancestors gave him the right to the throne, but it could not protect him from the curse that already lurked in his blood, waiting for its moment to turn the heir's life into a tragedy of ancient proportions. Fate rarely announces its arrival with a drum roll. More often, it appears in silence, in a casual gesture, in a children's game that suddenly ceases to be a game. For the 9-year-old Prince Baldwin, that moment came during play with his peers, the sons of the kingdom's noble barons. We know of this episode thanks to the greatest chronicler of that era, the prince's own tutor, Archbishop William of Tyre. He watched with concern as the boys, while playing, pinched and poked each other to see who could endure the pain the longest. Everyone screamed and laughed, pulling their hands away. Everyone except one. Baldwin, the heir to the throne, bore all the jabs with an imperturbable calm that his tutor first mistook for incredible fortitude and self-control, worthy of a future king. But when he approached and checked the boy's arm himself, his heart, by his own admission, was pierced with icy horror. The young prince felt no pain, none at all. In his right hand, the hand with which he would one day have to hold a sword and the royal scepter, there was no feeling. For any other person in the 12th century, this would have been an oddity. But for the enlightened mind of William of Tyre, familiar with the works of ancient and Arab physicians, this symptom could mean only one thing: the most terrible curse of the Middle Ages. The word lepra was surely uttered in a whisper, in secret chambers, far from the ears of the court. Leprosy, a disease considered not just a physical ailment, but a punishment from God, a sign of sinfulness. It meant a slow, agonizing death, the body decaying while still alive, turning a person into a living relic. But worse still, it meant social death, exile. A leper was required to wear a bell to warn of his approach, and was forbidden from entering cities or touching healthy people. But how could you exile the heir to the throne? This news became the terrible secret of the Jerusalem court, a silent horror that settled in the heart of his father, King Amalric. This knowledge, this curse, would henceforth become the invisible forge, where either a broken outcast or a king, unlike any other in history, would be shaped. From the moment of his diagnosis, young Baldwin's life became a kingdom of pain, not the physical pain he had ceased to feel in the affected parts of his body, but an existential, spiritual pain that became his constant companion and greatest teacher. Every dawn was now a reminder that his body was his enemy, a traitor that was slowly but relentlessly destroying itself from within. The disease progressed. Gradually, his limbs grew numb and deformed, and sores and nodules began to appear on his face, which would eventually turn him into an unrecognizable monster. But it was in this crucible of daily suffering and struggle against his own decay that his legendary will, as hard as Damascus steel, was forged. Where another would have broken, fallen into despair, or retreated to a monastery, Baldwin accepted the fight. He knew he had little time, and this knowledge gave every day of his life incredible meaning and intensity. His education did not stop. On the contrary, it became even more intensive. Realizing that he would soon lose the ability to wield a sword with two hands, he trained with redoubled energy to fight with one, becoming, according to his contemporaries, a superb horseman. He learned to control his horse solely with his legs, gripping the reins with his knees so that he could hold a weapon in his one healthy hand. This image, a crippled youth, tearing across the training field like a whirlwind, was in itself a challenge to fate. His mind, untouched by the disease, was honed like a blade. He eagerly absorbed knowledge of history, law, theology, and most importantly, military strategy. He studied the campaigns of Alexander the Great and Julius Caesar, analyzing the tactics of his enemies, the Saracens. Perhaps it was the constant awareness of his own fragility that forced him to seek strength in his intellect, in his ability to outwit, to anticipate, to strike where he was least expected. His will, tempered in this hell, was transformed into an absolute weapon, one that proved to be more fearsome than any sword, and one that his future adversary, the great Saladin, would not appreciate until it was too late. In the year 1174, King Amalric I died suddenly, and the burden of power fell upon the shoulders of his 13-year-old son. Baldwin IV ascended to the throne of the Kingdom of Jerusalem, and a crown was placed on his head that was, for him, more a crown of thorns. He became a boy king in a world of cruel and ambitious men, and worse, he became a leper king, whose disease could no longer remain a secret. The first signs of the illness on his face forced him to appear in public more and more often with a light veil, and in time, with the famous mask that would become an inseparable part of his legend. His accession to the throne was a signal to all predators, both within the kingdom and beyond. Saladin, to the south and east, saw this as a sign of Frankish weakness, a chance to deliver a decisive blow. And at the Jerusalem court, the struggle for power immediately intensified. The barons of the kingdom split into two warring parties. On one side were the so-called doves, a party of the local nobility, the poulains, born in the Holy Land. They were led by the most influential nobleman in the kingdom, Raymond III, Count of Tripoli. He was the king's closest male relative and was appointed regent until Baldwin came of age. Raymond was a pragmatist, a proponent of peaceful coexistence with his Muslim neighbors and of maintaining the fragile status quo. Opposing him were the Hawks, a party of newly arrived aristocrats and knights from Europe, who craved war, glory, and new lands. Their informal leader was a man with a reputation as a ruthless adventurer, Reynald de Chatillon, and their military force was provided by the powerful military religious orders, especially the Templars, led by their master, Odo de Saint-Amand. These men despised any treaties with the infidels and believed that the only language the Saracens understood was the language of the sword. And caught between these two millstones was the young, sick king. He had not just to rule, but to constantly maneuver, to play one faction against the other, to prevent them from tearing the kingdom apart even before Saladin could. This daily political struggle became another school for him, teaching him secrecy, patience, and the ability to deliver precise, calculated strikes. Deep inside, behind the royal regalia, behind the mask that hid his decaying flesh, a quiet but fierce fire burned in young Baldwin's soul. His main, secret motivation was not a thirst for glory, not a desire for conquest, and not fanatical piety, though that undoubtedly played a role. His primary driving force was a race against death. Unlike other monarchs who could plan decades ahead and pass their legacy to their sons, Baldwin knew he had no future. Every day he lived was both a gift and a step toward an inevitable, agonizing end. The chronicles testify that he was fully aware of the nature of his disease and understood that it left him no chance of living to old age. This sense of doom liberated him from many human weaknesses. He did not fear death on the battlefield, because a far more terrible fate awaited him in his own bed. He did not seek to accumulate wealth, because he knew he could not enjoy it. All his thoughts, all his colossal willpower, were focused on a single goal: to have enough time. To have enough time to do everything possible to save his kingdom, to postpone its fall, to give it a chance to survive after he was gone. This was not just a king's sense of duty, it was a personal, almost selfish mission. He wanted to prove, to himself, to his court, to his enemies, and perhaps to God himself, that his life, despite its curse, was not in vain. His body might be weak, but his kingdom, his legacy, had to remain strong. This desperate resolve gave all his actions incredible energy and audacity. He acted as if every campaign, every decree, was his last. He could not afford the luxury of waiting, of caution, of long diplomatic games. He had to strike quickly, decisively, and precisely, tearing every year, every month of existence for Jerusalem from the clutches of fate. It was this inner flame, fed by the awareness of his imminent end, that transformed the sick youth into the fearless leader who could challenge Saladin himself. While Baldwin was learning to rule his fractured kingdom, the star of his main antagonist was rising in the east. Salah al-Din was a figure straight out of an epic, a personality whose scale and complexity were no less than his young opponent's. He was not the barbarian or fanatic often portrayed by European chroniclers. He was an outstanding statesman, a subtle diplomat, a patron of the sciences and arts, and at the same time, a brilliant military commander and a deeply devout Muslim. Beginning his career in the service of the Syrian ruler Nur al-Din, he managed to become the vizier of Fatimid Egypt, and after his patron's death, the undisputed sultan, uniting Cairo and Damascus under his rule. His main mission, his life's work, was to unite the scattered Muslim states for a holy war against the Franks. He saw the Crusader states as a foreign body, a cancerous tumor on the body of the Islamic world that had to be excised. But unlike many of his predecessors, Saladin was a strategist. He understood that a frontal assault on the well-fortified Frankish castles was a losing proposition. His plan was to first create a unified front, catching Jerusalem in a giant pincer from the south, from Egypt, and the east, from Syria. And the accession of a 13-year-old sick boy to the throne seemed like a gift from fate. He, like many others, saw it as a sign of the kingdom's decline and imminent fall. He expected to face a regency council torn by intrigue, anarchy, and weakness. He simply could not imagine that his main adversary, his counterpart in this great game, would not be a council of barons, but the young king himself, whose will would prove stronger than the walls of any citadel. Their confrontation was not just a conflict of two religions or two states. It was a clash of two great personalities, two titans of their era. The wise, experienced unifier of Islam at the zenith of his glory, and the young, dying king whose only weapons were his mind and his desperation. The shadow of Saladin, vast and all-consuming, loomed over the Holy Land, and it seemed that nothing could stop him from fulfilling his dream. But the young king had no intention of passively waiting for his enemy to gather strength for a devastating blow. As soon as Baldwin came of age at 15 and removed the regent, Raymond of Tripoli, from power, he immediately began to act, forcing both friends and foes to see him in a new light. His first move on this grand chessboard was a daring and meticulously planned military campaign in 1176. The goal was not just another border raid, but a demonstration of strength in the very heart of Saladin's domains. Learning that the Sultan was busy besieging Aleppo, trying to subdue the last rebellious Syrian emirs, Baldwin assembled a small but mobile army and struck the Bekoya Valley and the vicinity of Damascus. It was a classic example of asymmetrical warfare. Lacking the forces for a full-scale invasion, the Leper King used speed and surprise. His knights swept like fire and sword through the richest lands belonging to Saladin, posing a direct threat to one of the most important cities in the Islamic world. This raid had enormous psychological significance. First, it forced Saladin to divert his attention from his plans to unify Syria and urgently move troops to protect his own territories. Second, it showed the Muslim rulers still resisting Saladin that the Kingdom of Jerusalem was a force to be reckoned with and a potential ally. But most importantly, this campaign was a shock to Saladin himself. He had expected passive defense from the sick youth, fear, pleas for a truce. Instead, he was met with an aggressive, well-thought-out, and humiliating attack on his own lands. He realized that the one sitting on the throne of Jerusalem was not a puppet of the barons, but a true warrior king, a worthy descendant of his ancestors. This first move, Baldwin's Damascus Gambit, sharply raised the stakes in their confrontation. It was a slap in the face that the proud Sultan could not forget, and it laid the foundation for the personal animosity and, at the same time, respect that these two great adversaries would feel for each other until the very end. Baldwin had proven that as long as he lived, his kingdom would not be the victim, but the predator. However, within the kingdom, there was a force that not even the king's will could always control. This force, this uncontrollable fire, was Reynald de Chatillon, Prince of Transjordan, Lord of the mighty castle of Kerak. Reynald was the embodiment of everything the Muslim world hated about the Crusaders. An adventurer, the younger son of a minor French nobleman, he had come to the East in search of fame and fortune, and had achieved both through his reckless bravery, cruelty, and utter disregard for any rules. He had already spent 16 years in Muslim captivity, which only hardened his hatred for the Saracens. His castle, Kerak, occupied a strategically vital position, controlling the caravan routes between Egypt and Syria. And Reynald, paying no attention to the truces made by his king, regularly launched plundering raids on the rich caravans traveling to Mecca and Medina. For Baldwin, Reynald de Chatillon was both a priceless asset and a constant headache. On one hand, his fortress was a crucial bastion on the southern border, a cork in the bottle that blocked direct communication between the two halves of Saladin's empire. His aggressive actions kept the enemy in a constant state of tension. On the other hand, his piratical escapades constantly undermined the fragile truces that Baldwin tried to maintain to buy time. Every raid by Reynold was a provocation, a personal insult to Saladin, who considered the protection of pilgrims his sacred duty. The Sultan repeatedly demanded that Baldwin rein in his vassal and return the stolen goods, but the king, even if he wanted to, could not always do so. The monarch's power in the feudal kingdom of Jerusalem was limited, and a powerful baron like Reynold enjoyed considerable autonomy. This dual situation created constant tension. Baldwin was forced to navigate, trying to use Reynold's aggression to his advantage, while at the same time preventing it from escalating into a full-scale war for which the kingdom was not yet ready. Reynold de Chatillon was the wild card in the deck, the unpredictable factor that would ultimately become the catalyst for the decisive clash. While weapons clashed on the kingdom's borders and political intrigues were woven, inside the palace, in the silence of his chambers, the king fought his most terrible war, the war against his own body. Leprosy advanced relentlessly, conquering his flesh inch by inch. What began with a loss of feeling in his hand was now turning into grotesque changes in his appearance. His face, once handsome, as chroniclers attest, became covered with nodules and sores, forcing him first to hide it under a light cloth, and then to conceal it entirely beneath the lifeless surface of a metal or leather mask. This mask became a powerful symbol of his reign. For his enemies, it was a sign of his impurity, his weakness, proof that God had turned away from the Franks. In Saladin's camp, they surely spoke with contempt of the Leper King, who could not even show his face. But for his subjects, for his knights and soldiers, this mask eventually acquired a completely different, almost mystical meaning. It hid his physical decay, but in doing so, it emphasized the incredible strength of spirit that lived inside that crumbling shell. The king, deprived of a normal human appearance, was becoming something more, a living icon, a symbol of unyielding resistance. When, despite excruciating pain and weakness, he personally led his troops into battle, his masked figure inspired a sacred awe in his warriors. They saw before them not just a sick man, but a martyr who was sacrificing himself for their salvation, for the defense of the Holy Land. This psychological effect was colossal. His infirmity became the source of their strength. His suffering became the pledge of their faith. He was the embodiment of the idea of sacrifice that lies at the heart of Christianity. Paradoxically, the more the disease destroyed his body, the stronger his authority became, the brighter his myth shone. He ceased to be just a monarch. He became a symbol, a banner, and this intangible weapon was perhaps the most formidable in his arsenal. Recognizing his military and demographic inferiority, Baldwin understood that the war against the united Islamic world could not be won by willpower and the courage of his knights alone. Diplomacy was as important a battlefield for him as the scorching sands of Palestine. His main hope and strategic goal was an alliance with the only Christian superpower in the region, the Byzantine Empire. Emperor Manuel Komnenos was one of the most outstanding rulers in Byzantine history, and his interests in the Levant largely coincided with those of the Kingdom of Jerusalem. He also saw a threat in the rapid rise of Saladin, and was interested in maintaining a Frankish buffer between his Anatolian domains and the Sultan's new empire. Baldwin, continuing his father's policy, sent an embassy to Constantinople with an ambitious plan for a joint invasion of Egypt, the economic heart of Saladin's power. A strike against Egypt could not only weaken the Sultan, but could also undermine the very foundations of his power. Manuel accepted the proposal with enthusiasm, and for a while, it seemed that fortune had smiled upon the Crusaders. The Byzantine fleet, numbering, according to various estimates, between 150 to 200 ships, was to join the Frankish army for a decisive blow. However, this grand plan was doomed to fail due to internal disagreements and mutual distrust. One of the most influential barons of the kingdom, Philip of Flanders, who had arrived from Europe with his army, refused to cooperate with the Byzantines, pursuing his own selfish goals. Time was lost, and the Byzantine fleet, after waiting for several months, sailed away with nothing. This failure was a bitter lesson for Baldwin. He realized that his kingdom was, in essence, alone. European monarchs were preoccupied with their own quarrels and were in no hurry to help. The Byzantines, despite their common interests, were unreliable allies. Jerusalem could only count on its own strength, on the steel of its knights, and on the will of its dying king. This realization of isolation only strengthened his resolve to act boldly and unconventionally, for there was no help to be expected from anywhere. Despite his advancing illness, which confined him to his bed more and more often, Baldwin possessed surprisingly accurate and timely information about his enemy's plans and movements. His mind remained as sharp as a razor, and he understood perfectly that in a war against superior forces, intelligence was the key to survival. The Kingdom of Jerusalem, over the decades of its existence, had created an extensive and effective intelligence network. The eyes and ears of the king were not just the knights patrolling the borders. A crucial role was played by the Turcopoles, light cavalry recruited from the local Christianized population, who knew the terrain, languages, and customs perfectly. They were ideal scouts, capable of penetrating deep into enemy territory and bringing back valuable information. In addition, the Franks actively used spies in major cities like Damascus and Cairo. The trade caravans that constantly traveled between Muslim and Christian lands were also an invaluable source of information. Italian merchants, Bedouin tribes who often switched their allegiance, all could sell important news for a good price. The military religious orders played a special role in this system. The Templars and Hospitallers had their own network of informants and agents, independent of the crown, scattered throughout the Middle East. And although they often clashed with the royal authority on political issues in the face of a common threat, they shared their intelligence. Baldwin, with his analytical mind, personally studied the reports, compared facts, and tried to anticipate Saladin's next move. He knew when the Sultan was assembling an army, what forces he was bringing to the border, and what mood his emirs were in. This awareness allowed him to compensate for the shortage of soldiers. He could not afford the luxury of keeping large garrisons along the entire border. Instead, he kept his small elite forces as a mobile reserve, and, thanks to accurate intelligence, could move them precisely where the main blow was expected. Thus, even while physically infirm, the king was always mentally present on the battlefield, his strategic gaze penetrating far beyond the walls of Jerusalem, tracking his prey. The year 1177 arrived. A deceptive calm settled on the borders of the Kingdom of Jerusalem. But it was not the silence of peace, but that of a predator crouching before its springs. Saladin, having concluded a temporary truce with the Franks, was fully focused on strengthening his power within the Islamic world. He had finally subjugated Syria, dealing with the last opposition emirs. Now his empire was a monolith, a giant pincer gripping the Crusader kingdom from the south and east. He was assembling an army the likes of which the Levant had not seen in a long time. From all corners of his sprawling empire, from Egypt, Syria, the upper Euphrates, troops were converging on Damascus. Chroniclers on both sides speak of preparations for a decisive campaign, for a holy war whose goal was not just another border skirmish, but the complete and final annihilation of the Kingdom of Jerusalem. In Jerusalem, This tension was palpable. Everyone understood that the truce was just a short respite, and that the storm was bound to break. Baldwin used this time to strengthen his defenses. City walls were repaired, and supplies and fortresses were replenished. But the main problem remained unsolved: a catastrophic shortage of men. All the military forces of the kingdom, including garrisons, militia, and the contingents of the knightly orders, barely exceeded 20,000 men, and to gather them all in one place was impossible without leaving all the borders exposed. Baldwin knew that Saladin would assemble an army at least twice, if not 3 times larger. The situation seemed hopeless. The days dragged on in anxious anticipation. More and more frightening news about the scale of Saladin's military preparations arrived with caravans and from spies. It was the classic calm before the storm, when the air becomes still and thick, and dark clouds are already gathering on the horizon, heralding a hurricane of unprecedented force. Everyone in the kingdom, from the common soldier to the king, was asking the same question: when and where would the Sultan strike? And a pretext for the strike was not long in coming. The catalyst, the spark that lit the powder keg, was once again the indomitable Reynald de Chatillon. Violating the existing truce, he carried out another daring raid, this time on a large and wealthy Muslim caravan traveling from Syria to Egypt. This was not just a military sortie, it was a slap in the face to Saladin himself. The Sultan immediately sent envoys to Baldwin with an angry demand to return the captured loot and punish his vassal. For the young king, this was a moment of truth. He found himself in an almost impossible situation. To satisfy Saladin's demand would mean not only accepting humiliation, but also provoking an open rebellion from the powerful Hawk party and from Reynald himself, who would never have obeyed such an order. To refuse, however, meant giving Saladin the perfect casus belli, a pretext for invasion that would look just in the eyes of the entire Islamic world. Baldwin, true to his pride and understanding the futility of concessions, chose the second path. He refused the Sultan's envoys. For Saladin, this was the long-awaited signal. He could now begin a holy war, not just as a conqueror, but as a defender of the faith and justice, insulted by the treachery of the Franks. The call to jihad spread throughout his empire. The army, already assembled and ready to march, was set in motion. Saladin personally led his forces and moved out of Egypt, crossing the border of the Kingdom of Jerusalem. His plan was simple and effective: to deliver a swift blow to the southern frontiers, capture the key fortress of Ascalon, and from there, march directly on an almost defenseless Jerusalem. He was absolutely confident of success. His army was huge, and opposing it, he believed, were only the small garrison of Ascalon and a sick boy king, locked up in his capital. The last drop had fallen, and the fragile dam that had held back the torrents of war collapsed. The avalanche was set in motion. Saladin's army, which invaded the Kingdom of Jerusalem in November of 1177, was a truly terrifying sight. The exact numbers, as is often the case with medieval chronicles, vary, but even the most conservative estimates speak of more than 20,000 warriors, while Arab sources proudly name figures up to 30,000. This was not just a mob, but a well-organized, multinational military machine. The core of the army was the Sultan's personal guard, thousands of elite Mamluk cavalrymen, professionals for whom war was a way of life. They were followed by contingents from Egypt, Syria, and Mesopotamia, Turkic, Kurdish, and Arab cavalry, Nubian infantry archers, and detachments of volunteers who had come from all corners of the Islamic world to take part in the Holy War. This army moved north along the coast, leaving a trail of smoke and devastation in its wake. Their first target was Ascalon, the most important strategic fortress in the south of the kingdom, the gateway to Jerusalem. Saladin expected to meet fierce resistance here, perhaps even the main Frankish army. But to his surprise, he found the city's garrison to be small. King Baldwin, it seemed, had made a fatal mistake, leaving the southern border virtually undefended. This news only strengthened the Sultan's confidence in an easy victory. He left part of his forces to blockade Ascalon and, with his main army, moved deeper into the kingdom, toward Jerusalem. He believed that the Leper King was either locked up in his capital, trembling with fear, or that his army was so small he did not dare to take the field. This confidence grew into overconfidence, and then into a fatal error. Believing there was no longer any threat, Saladin relaxed discipline in his army. He allowed a significant portion of his troops to spread out across the surrounding countryside to plunder and gather provisions. Villages were burned, fields were trampled, and the population was driven into slavery. The army, which had recently been a single steel fist, had turned into a sprawling, unguarded mass, reveling in its own impunity. The Sultan, the great strategist, could not have imagined that at that very moment, a small army of the doomed, led by a phantom in a mask, was moving toward him, hidden by the hills. News of the invasion and Saladin's rapid advance reached Jerusalem, sparking panic and despair. It seemed that all was lost. The Council of Barons begged the king to stay in the city, to take refuge behind its powerful walls and prepare for a long siege, hoping that Saladin, after plundering the surroundings, would leave on his own. Any attempt to meet his army in the open field was considered pure suicide. But it was precisely at this moment of desperation that the 16-year-old Baldwin showed the incredible resolve that made him a legend. He rejected all the advice of his experienced nobles. He understood what they did not. To sit through a siege was to give the enemy the initiative, and to die a slow death from starvation and disease. The only chance of salvation, however slim, lay in action, in a daring, unthinkable counterattack. He gave the order to assemble all available forces, and these forces were depressingly small. The chroniclers report that he managed to gather only about 375 knights. Among them was a contingent of 80 Templars, led by their furious master, Odo de Saint-Amand. They were joined by a few thousand infantrymen militia. In total, his army hardly numbered 5,000 or 6,000 men, with its striking force consisting of only a few hundred heavily armed horsemen. This was not an army. It was a handful of brave men. And with these forces, Baldwin made an unthinkable decision. He marched out of Jerusalem and moved south, toward Saladin's 30,000-strong army. This march was a march of the doomed. Every participant, from the common foot soldier to the king, knew that there was virtually no chance of victory. But they marched. They were driven not by hope of victory, but by desperate resolve and absolute faith in their young, sick leader. Baldwin, too weak to stay in the saddle for long, was carried on a litter for most of the journey. But when the enemy drew near, he would mount his horse so that his warriors could see their king at the head of their column. It was a procession of ghosts going to battle a Titan, and it was this suicidal courage that became the first element of their future victory. The strategy Baldwin chose was the only one possible in his situation. It was a strategy of the impossible. He had no intention of engaging in a classic battle, lining up his troops in the field against the Saracen armada. That would have been a guaranteed and swift defeat. His plan was more subtle and cunning, built on 3 pillars: speed, surprise, and knowledge of the terrain. While Saladin was moving along the main, well-known road, his huge army stretched for miles, and its vanguard was blinded by its own overconfidence. Baldwin led his small force along an old coastal road known as the Way of the Philistines. He moved quickly, lightly. bypassing enemy patrols and remaining invisible to the main army of the Sultan. His goal was not just to meet the enemy, but to intercept him at a time and place where Saladin's numerical advantage would be nullified. He turned his weakness, his small numbers, into a strength. A small detachment could move much faster and more stealthily than a giant army. He knew that Saladin, believing him to be trapped in Jerusalem, had relaxed his guard and allowed his troops to disperse. His entire plan was based on this enemy mistake. He was not going to attack the Sultan's whole army. He intended to deliver a lightning-fast, decapitating strike at its center, at Saladin's own headquarters, causing panic and chaos among the stretched-out and unprepared ranks. It was an all-or-nothing gamble, a daring gambit with the entire kingdom at stake. Success depended on whether he could catch the enemy by surprise. Any accident, any sentry who might have spotted him too early, would have led to disaster. But luck on that day was on the side of the desperate. The Crusader army, led by its king, glided like a phantom through the hills, closing in on the unsuspecting enemy to deliver a blow that would forever be remembered in the annals of military history. The key element of Baldwin's brilliant plan was not only the maneuver, but also the choice of the perfect place for battle. On the 25th of November, 1177, his army caught up with Saladin's forces near a small hill called Tel Gezer, which the Crusaders named Montgisard. This place was as if made for a miracle. Saladin's army, stretched out and in disarray, was just crossing a small stream in a low-lying area. The terrain was broken and hilly, which prevented the vast mass of Saracen cavalry from quickly forming up for battle and using its numerical advantage. Baldwin, however, brought his army onto high ground, gaining a tactical advantage. He looked down on the enemy camp, which was a chaotic cluster of men busy with plunder and rest, not preparing for a fight. Saladin and his personal Mamluk guard were in the center of this mass, completely confident in their safety. Baldwin realized this was his only chance. He knew that if he gave the enemy even half an hour, they could organize, and then his small army would be simply swept away. A decision had to be made immediately, and he made it. He gave the order to attack on the move, straight from the march, giving his men no time for thought or fear. The plan was simple and suicidal. The full force of the heavy knightly cavalry, that steel battering ram, was to crash down from the hill directly into the center of the enemy army, onto the personal guard and the Sultan himself. This was not just a battle, it was a surgical operation aimed at eliminating the dragon's head with a single, precise, and deadly blow. The Valley of Montgisard, as it is sometimes called, became the stage upon which the final and most desperate drama of the Leper King's life was to be played out, and he was ready to play his leading role. And then came the moment that contemporaries described with religious awe, the moment that turned the battle into a legend. Before giving the order to attack, King Baldwin, who was only 16 years old, was helped by his squires to dismount with difficulty from his horse. His body was so weak that he could barely stand. In front of his entire army, before the knights in their shining armor and the common foot soldiers in their dusty tunics, he fell to his knees. Beside him, the Bishop of Bethlehem raised the primary relic of the Kingdom of Jerusalem, a piece of the true cross, on which, it was believed, Jesus Christ was crucified. In the ensuing silence, broken only by the clatter of weapons and the neighing of horses, the young king, his disfigured face hidden by a mask, prostrated himself on the ground and, with tears in his eyes, began to pray. He prayed not for victory, but for strength, for his warriors, for the salvation of his people. This spectacle had an incredible psychological effect on the Crusader army. They saw not just their feudal lord, they saw a holy martyr who, like Christ, was sacrificing himself for them. His physical weakness, his suffering, his desperate faith, all of it transformed into a powerful emotional charge. According to the chronicler, when the king rose, his warriors were seized with such religious ecstasy, such fury, that they surged forward without waiting for the command. They rushed into battle, eager to die for their king and their faith. Baldwin mounted his horse again, and the army, as one, moved down the slope. This was no longer just an attack. It was an act of faith, a crusade in miniature. And this unbreakable moral strength, born in the moment of the dying king's prayer, became the final, decisive component that turned a suicidal venture into a triumph. What happened next was more like a volcanic eruption than a medieval battle. The charge that changed history began with the devastating impact of the Templars. 80 Knights of the Temple, led by their master, Odo de Saint-Amand, formed a steel wedge and were the first to smash into the unprepared Saracen ranks. This was their finest hour, the embodiment of all their fanatical faith and martial fury. Behind them, gathering terrifying speed on the slope of the hill, followed the rest of the knightly cavalry, 300 lances of iron-clad horsemen, each worth a dozen ordinary warriors. The impact was so sudden and powerful that the first line of Saladin's army was crushed and thrown back almost instantly. The Mamluks, the Sultan's personal guard, the best warriors of the Islamic world, were caught completely by surprise. Many of them did not even have time to mount their horses or take up their arms. The knights hacked their way through their ranks like a knife through butter, leaving a path of bodies behind them. The chaos that engulfed the vanguard instantly spread to the entire army. The troops, stretched out for miles, did not understand what was happening. They only saw their celebrated champions fleeing, and panic, like a plague, began to spread from one unit to another. Saladin himself was in mortal danger. The Crusaders broke through to his headquarters, and the Sultan barely escaped, losing almost his entire personal guard, including his nephew's son, in the fighting. His flight was the signal for a general rout. The huge, invincible army, which only an hour before had been reveling in its strength, turned into an uncontrollable mob, mad with fear. Every man fled for his life. The Crusader infantry, arriving shortly after, completed the rout, cutting down the fleeing soldiers. The Battle of Montgisard turned into a slaughter. It was not just a victory, it was the complete annihilation of an enemy army, achieved by a handful of warriors inspired by the will of their dying king. The consequences of the Battle of Montgisard were as stunning as the victory itself. Of Saladin's vast army, according to the chroniclers, barely a tenth survived. The fields were littered with the bodies of thousands of his best warriors. He lost his entire baggage train, his treasury, and, most devastatingly, his reputation for invincibility. The Sultan himself, escaping on a swift camel, barely avoided capture and reached Cairo almost alone. For him, this was not just a military defeat. It was a profound personal humiliation. He, the unifier of Islam, had been routed and put to flight by a sick boy. This wound to his pride would never heal. For the Kingdom of Jerusalem, the victory at Montgisard was a true miracle, a divine intervention that postponed its demise for nearly a decade. The immediate threat of annihilation was lifted. The authority of Baldwin IV soared. He became a legend in his own lifetime, his fame spreading throughout Europe and the entire Islamic world. He was nicknamed the Victorious King, and even his enemies were forced to acknowledge his incredible courage and military genius. But this victory came at a price. Many noble knights fell in the battle, and despite the enemy's rout, the kingdom's manpower remained stretched to the limit. And for Baldwin himself, the miracle of Montgisard could not reverse the ultimate sentence. It gave him glory. It saved his kingdom, but it could not heal his body. He had won the battle against the greatest sultan, but his personal war with death continued, and in that war he was doomed to lose. Therein lay the ultimate irony of his triumph. The victory at Montgisard was the peak of Baldwin's military career, but it also marked the beginning of his slow, tragic decline. The glory of being the savior of Jerusalem could not stop the destructive work of the disease. His greatest enemy continued its advance, and he could not hide from it behind fortress walls or defeat it in open battle. The last years of his life are a chronicle of an agonizing but incredibly dignified struggle against the inevitable. Leprosy progressed with terrifying speed. Soon, he became blind. His hands and feet were so mutilated and devoid of sensation that he could neither walk nor hold a sword. He became a living relic, a stump of a human body, completely dependent on his servants. But even in this state, he did not abandon the throne. His mind remained clear and sharp, and his will unbreakable. He continued to rule his kingdom from a litter that was carried from the council chamber to his private rooms. When a military threat arose, he demanded to be carried into battle on a palanquin at the head of the army. Imagine this surreal spectacle. At the forefront of the Crusader army, a litter is carried, upon which lies a blind, crippled, but still reigning king. He had become a living icon, a banner, inspiring his warriors to battle by his mere presence. He continued to take part in campaigns, direct sieges, and repel the raids of Saladin, who, having recovered from the humiliation of Montgisard, had renewed his attacks. This final phase of his life was perhaps an even greater feat than his famous victory. It was a daily, hourly victory of spirit over matter, of will over decay. In 1185, at the age of just 24, Baldwin IV died. His short but dazzlingly bright life, like the flight of a comet, came to an end. He departed, undefeated on the battlefield, but vanquished by his internal enemy, leaving his kingdom on the brink of a new, even more terrible catastrophe. Baldwin's death became a death sentence for the kingdom of Jerusalem. While he was alive, his iron will, his authority, and his skill at navigating between warring factions held back the centrifugal forces that were tearing the state apart from within. But as soon as he was gone, the dam broke. Power passed to his brother-in-law, Guy de Lusignan, a weak-willed and indecisive man who fell completely under the influence of the Hawk party, led by the irrepressible Raynald de Chatillon. The fragile balance that Baldwin had so desperately maintained collapsed. Raynald, feeling liberated, launched his most audacious and fatal raid, attacking a caravan that was rumored to include Saladin's own sister. This was the last straw that broke the Sultan's patience. This time, he prepared much more carefully. He assembled the largest army he had ever fielded and swore not to return until he had wiped the Frankish kingdom from the face of the earth. In the summer of 1187, just 2 years after Baldwin's death, the armies met near the cliffs known as the Horns of Hattin. The new Crusader leadership made every possible strategic error. They allowed Saladin to lure them into a waterless desert, cut them off from water sources, and surround them. The ensuing battle turned into a massacre. Almost the entire Crusader army was destroyed or captured. The flower of Jerusalem's knighthood perished. King Guy de Lusignan was taken prisoner, and Raynald de Chatillon was personally beheaded by Saladin. The catastrophe at Hattin was total and final. After it, the kingdom simply had no forces left to defend itself. One by one, cities and fortresses surrendered to Saladin, and a few months later, Jerusalem itself fell. The tragic paradox was that everything Baldwin had fought for so desperately, everything he had saved with his brilliant victory at Montgisard, was lost in just 2 years after his death. This most terrible defeat in the history of the Crusades only served to highlight more vividly the greatness of the young Leper King, who alone had held back the avalanche that engulfed his heirs. So how did he do it? How did a dying youth at the head of a handful of warriors manage to crush the army of the great Saladin? Now, looking back, we can finally solve this paradox by weaving together all the threads of our narrative. The victory at Montgisard was not the result of a single factor. It was a perfect storm, a unique confluence of circumstances, at the center of which stood the titanic figure of Baldwin himself. First, it was his personal genius and unbending will. His disease, his curse, became his greatest weapon. It stripped him of the fear of death and forced his mind to work with incredible sharpness and desperate courage. He was willing to take risks that a healthy monarch with something to lose never would. Second, it was the fatal mistake of his opponent. Saladin, one of the greatest commanders in history, committed the classic sin of hubris. He underestimated his enemy, contemptuously dismissing the sick boy. This overconfidence caused him to lose his vigilance, disperse his forces, and fall into a trap he should have foreseen. Third, it was tactical perfection. Baldwin brilliantly used his knowledge of the terrain, speed, and the element of surprise, turning his small numbers from a disadvantage into an advantage. The choice of time and place for the attack was flawless. Fourth, it was the unsurpassed power of the heavy knightly cavalry, especially the fanatical and disciplined Templars, who on that day showed everything they were capable of. Their charge was like a hammer blow that could break through any armor. And finally, fifth, it was the incredible moral uplift, the religious ecstasy that gripped the Crusader army at the sight of their praying king. They were not going into battle for land or loot. They were going to die for their holy martyr king. Thus, the paradox is resolved. The king's physical weakness became the source of his spiritual strength, which, in turn, inspired his army to a miracle. And the genius of a strategist allowed him to focus this spiritual energy on a single point and strike at the most vulnerable moment of his most powerful opponent. Baldwin's victory was a triumph of asymmetrical warfare, where spirit, intellect, and desperation proved stronger than numbers and brute force. The legend of Baldwin IV, the Leper King, has endured through the centuries, becoming one of the most powerful and tragic stories in the history of the Middle Ages. His figure has transcended the dry historical chronicles, becoming an eternal archetype, a symbol interpreted differently in different eras and cultures. For the Western world, especially during the Romantic era of the 19th century, he became the embodiment of the ideal Crusader knight, a Christian martyr whose short life was an act of supreme sacrifice in the name of faith. His mask became a symbol of mystery and suffering, and his victory at Montgisard, proof that with God's help, even a David can defeat a Goliath. In modern culture, his image continues to captivate minds, appearing in books, films, and games, where he is portrayed as a tragic hero, fighting not only external enemies, but also the inner demon of his illness. Interestingly, even in the Arab world, despite being an enemy, his figure evoked not only hatred, but also respect. Arab chroniclers, such as Ibn al-Athir, noted his incredible bravery and the strength of spirit he displayed, despite his terrible affliction. They saw in him a worthy adversary for their great hero, Saladin. But perhaps Baldwin's most important legacy is not historical, but philosophical. His story is a profound and poignant meditation on the nature of strength and weakness. It poses timeless questions. What is true strength? Does it lie in physical health, in muscles and armies? Or is its source found somewhere deeper, in the power of the human spirit, in the will, in the ability to rise above one's suffering and turn it into one's greatest weapon. The life of Baldwin IV provides an unequivocal answer to this question. It stands as an eternal monument to the triumph of the human spirit over the frailty of the flesh, a testament to the fact that even in the most broken body, an indomitable will can reside, capable of changing the course of history. And as long as humanity admires courage in the face of the impossible, the legend of the young Leper King who crushed a great army will live on,